Who let this ragged woman in? Who let this ragged woman in here? You're dirtying my floor. Mara Voss kept walking, straight to the center of the mirrored room, 27 years old. Thin, dark brown hair tied back in a hurry, her hands rough from back-to-back shifts mopping floors and washing dishes. I'm here for my son. You owe him an explanation. Bruno Halsey turned to his students and smirked into the camera that was broadcasting live. That beggar's kid? Ran home crying to Mommy. What are you gonna do, hit me? You're going to regret this, she said, her voice calm enough to chill the room. Bruno's smirk faded. A poor widow in a faded coat was looking at him the way you look at a child throwing a tantrum. He pulled out a thick stack of cash. 20 grand, cash. All you've got to do is land one shot on me. He slammed the bills across her face. The money burst apart and scattered across the floor. Hit me! Mara didn't pick up the money. She set her basket down, slowly, the way someone sets down something sacred. Left foot back, weight low, hands open, perfectly still. At the doorway, a man in a tailored dark suit had just stepped in to collect the debt Bruno still owed him. Killian Reyes, 34, broad-shouldered, a thin scar running along his jaw, eyes cold enough to read a person in 3 seconds. And the moment he saw that stance, the blood drained from his face. He'd seen it once, long ago, from the very teacher who'd trained both him and this woman. Stop, he roared, his voice cracking across the room. But it was already too late, because what Cillian Reyes had just recognized in the stance of a widow, nobody would have looked at twice, shattered everything Bruno Halsey believed about strength, about money, and about the woman he'd just humiliated in front of thousands of people watching live. If this story moves you, drop a like and share it with someone who needs reminding that they were never as weak as they thought. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Stick around, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Many hours before that room full of mirrors erupted, before any stack of money was thrown into her face, Mara Voss had been standing in the Ashport boarding house at 4 o'clock in the morning, her work shoes still wet with dew, quietly sliding her key into the rusted lock. The night shift had just ended. 8 hours of scrubbing the hallway floors of an office building she would never be able to afford to enter in daylight, followed by 2 more hours washing dishes at the diner at the end of the street, all of it pressing down on the thin shoulders of a woman, only 27 years old, but already walking like someone far more exhausted than that. She didn't turn on the main light. Theo was still asleep, and she had grown used to moving through the darkness of her cramped apartment like a blind person who knew every corner of every wall by heart. Mara set down the laundry basket, untied the scarf around her hair, and let her dark brown hair fall over one shoulder. On the kitchen table lay a stack of envelopes she had deliberately turned face down. She knew what was inside them. The medical bills still hanging over her from that winter 2 years earlier. Each month, she paid a little. So little that the debt barely seemed to move at all, just lying there and looking at her like a scar that refused to heal. She turned one envelope over, looked at the number, then turned it face down again. Some things, when looked at in the morning, could ruin an entire day, and she didn't allow herself to be ruined right now. She put a pot of oatmeal on the stove, stirred it evenly, and added a little cinnamon she had bought cheaply as the market was closing. Her hand moved the wooden spoon slowly, and beneath the weak yellow kitchen light, anyone could have seen the stubborn calluses across her palm and at the base of her fingers. They weren't the calluses of someone who only knew how to scrub. Some of the hardened lines sat in strange places, along the edge of her hand, near the side of her index finger and thumb, as though that hand had once gripped something tightly for many years, something that wasn't a mop. But Mara never looked down at her hands for too long. She had learned not to look. She heard small feet shuffling behind her. Theo, 7 years old, with his hair wildly tousled, stepped out rubbing his eyes. He was hugging the sketchbook he never left behind for even half a step. "You're home, Mom?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Mara turned around, and all the weariness on her face seemed to be gently wiped away by an unseen hand. "I'm home," she said. "Sit down. The oatmeal's hot." She ladled a bowl for him, blowing gently to cool it down, then watched him eat with the kind of attention only poor mothers understand, the gaze of someone counting every spoonful that entered her child's mouth, as if counting each small victory in a long war. The boy told her about the dream he had the night before, about a dragon that knew how to draw pictures. And Mara nodded, smiled, and asked the right questions in the right places. even though her eyelids felt unbearably heavy. On the wall, beside the old calendar, hung a small, faded picture frame, a photograph of her, and a broad-shouldered man smiling, both of them still young, still whole, still unaware of what was waiting ahead. Mara didn't look at that photograph in the morning. She saved it for sleepless nights. When Theo finished eating, she wiped his mouth, told him to change his clothes, and said Mrs. Edna would take him to the new class today. The boy's eyes lit up at the mention of it, and that very brightness made Mara's heart tighten with a strange beat, a vague premonition she immediately pushed aside. She had saved for months, even skipping her own lunches, to gather enough money for him to attend the training room he had become fascinated with through videos online. She didn't truly like that place. Something inside her, some old instinct that had been sleeping for a very long time, gave a faint ache every time she thought of rooms filled with mirrors, the smell of sweat and leather, the dull thud of fists striking heavy bags. She had once known that world very well. She had once been an entirely different person in that world. But that woman had been carefully folded away and put aside long ago, along with something lying in the cardboard box beneath the bed, something she hadn't opened in many years. Mara stood, washed the dishes, then watched her son put on his coat and backpack, and she told herself today would be an ordinary day like any other. She was wrong, because in just a few hours, the door she had kept closed for so many years would be brutally torn open by a merciless hand, and the woman she had once buried would be forced to step back into the light. The cardboard box beneath Mara's bed had been there so long that dust had settled over it, in a fine layer like velvet, and she hadn't pulled it out once since the day she moved into this cramped apartment, but she knew exactly what was inside, knew it the way people know a lost part of their own body that sometimes still aches. Inside was a fencing jacket of white canvas that had yellowed with age, a steel mesh mask, a pair of gloves worn smooth across the palms, and rolled at the bottom, wrapped in a soft cloth, was the thing she had never allowed herself to touch again, because the girl who had owned those things no longer existed, or at least Mara had believed so for many years. 10 years ago, people called her by another name inside brightly lit arenas. Mara Lindgren, still carrying her maiden name then, was the 17-year-old girl who stepped onto the national fencing strip with a calm that made even seasoned referees raise their brows. She wasn't the strongest. She wasn't the tallest. But she had something her coach called an eye that could read time, the ability to see an opponent's blade before it was even swung, as though a clock inside her mind ran half a beat slower than the rest of the world. She won the National Junior Championship at 18, then earned medals at tournaments where her name began appearing in small sports columns. But fencing was only the beginning. The person who saw something in her deeper than speed and reflexes was a man named Aldous Crane. Sensei Crane was already past 50 then, a quiet legend in the world of defensive martial arts, a man who had trained bodyguards, tactical police, and the few students he chose not because of talent, but because of character. He came to her after a match, offered no praise, and said only one sentence Mara remembered to this day, that she knew how to win, but she didn't yet know how to protect, and those two things weren't the same. He took her on as a Krav Maga student, in a practical self-defense art, with no arena, no medals, no audience, only one single principle that he repeated until it sank into her bones, that the purpose of strength wasn't to bring someone down, but to keep yourself and the people you loved safe. Crane taught her how to shift her center of gravity by just 1 centimeter, how to turn an opponent's force into their own weakness, how to lock a wrist without needing to break it, how to end a confrontation before it could become a slaughter. He taught her a special stance. He called the gatekeeper's stance. Left foot set back, weight lowered, both hands open and still, a posture that looked loose at first glance, but was in truth like a bowstring drawn to its limit. It was his mark, the thing only Crane's true students carried within them, and he once told her that in this world, he had passed it on to very few people, no more than could be counted on one hand, and that he saw each of them as his own children. Mara became one of them. By 20, she was both competing and helping Crane teach classes, teaching other women how to protect themselves, teaching children how to stay calm when they were afraid. She was so good that Crane once said, half joking and half serious, that one day she would take his place and preserve everything he left behind. But life didn't follow the path the old teacher had imagined. A turning point came, something even her time-reading eye hadn't seen coming. And after that turning point, Mara removed everything with her own hands, folded the jacket, rolled the gloves into the soft cloth, closed the cardboard box, and pushed it deep into the darkness beneath the bed. She never pulled it out again. She never mentioned Crane's name to anyone, not even to her own son. She buried that woman so deep that sometimes she almost believed the woman had never existed. She had no way of knowing that not far away, in this same city, there was another man who also carried Aldous Crane's mark within him, and that fate was quietly drawing those two lives closer together. The turning point that closed away the woman she had once been had a name, and that name was Daniel Voss. He came into Mara's life not through a fencing strip or a martial arts class, but on a rainy afternoon when her car died in the middle of the road and he, a rescue engineer who had just finished his shift, stopped to help her push it to the curb without asking too many questions. Daniel was the kind of man who made people feel safe simply by being there, broad-shouldered, with large hands and a slow smile, as though he had all the time in the world to give to the person standing before him. He worked on a structural rescue team, and his job was to run into the places other people ran out of, to keep people safe. Perhaps that was why those two people found each other, because both of them understood that protecting someone was the most sacred thing a human being could do. They married in a small ceremony, with no medals, no audience, only a few friends, and one simple promise. Theo was born, and for those few brief years, Mara had something she had never dared dream of: a whole home, a man who called her the strongest woman he had ever known, and a child she could hold in her arms every night. She was still teaching self-defense then, still leading weekend classes, and Daniel often teased that he was the safest man in the city because he had a wife like her. Then came the day Mara would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was a morning that seemed like every other morning, and she stopped by the construction site where Daniel worked to bring him the lunchbox he had forgotten. She stood there at the foot of the scaffolding, talking to him through the safety netting, and the two of them were still laughing about some small thing she later could never remember. Then everything happened too fast. A strange sound. The sound of metal grinding against metal. A sound her ears recognized as wrong before her mind had time to understand. That eye that could read time, the gift Crane had once praised, the ability to see everything half a beat slower, became a torture for the first time in her life. Because she saw, she understood, she knew what was about to happen, and still she could do nothing to stop it. She had lunged forward. She had called his name, but there are distances, no speed, no skill, no human strength can cross in time, and the distance between her and Daniel that morning was one of them. The woman who had spent all her youth learning how to protect others stood there, only a few steps away from her husband. Yet, she couldn't save him. That was the thing Mara never forgave herself for. Not the pain of losing her husband, though that pain was enough to drown her. It was the poisonous thought that kept returning through long nights, that everything she had ever learned, all the strength, all the quickness people had once praised, had ultimately meant nothing at the exact moment she needed it most. Her strength hadn't saved the person she loved most. So what meaning did it have left? After the funeral, Mara went home and quietly removed everything. She folded the fencing jacket, rolled the gloves into the cloth, pushed the box deep beneath the bed, and made herself a silent vow that she would never touch those things again. Because in her mind then, martial arts, strength, everything tied to the old version of herself, had all betrayed her at the most important moment. She didn't deserve to hold them again. She folded the woman she had once been away with that fencing jacket, and from that day on, she was only Mara Voss, the mother working 2 shifts to raise her son, the widow paying medical debt $1 at a time, the woman who lowered her head and moved through life so no one would look at her twice. She lived that way for 2 years. She believed she could live that way forever. Until the afternoon her son came home earlier than usual, strangely silent, carrying in his eyes something that froze the mother's heart inside her. The clock on the wall had only just passed 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Mara heard the knock at the door, and from that very rhythm, the hesitant and too gentle rhythm of someone carrying bad news, she knew something was wrong. Theo was supposed to be in class until 5 o'clock. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, opened the door, and saw Mrs. Edna standing there, the elderly neighbor who lived at the end of the boarding house row. One hand resting on Theo's shoulder as if shielding him, her wrinkled face carrying a look that was both pitying and tightly restrained with anger. Theo stood beside her, his backpack still on his shoulders, his head lowered, not rushing into his mother's arms the way he did every day. The boy wasn't crying. That was the first thing that made Mara's heart tighten. Because a 7-year-old child crying was one thing, But a 7-year-old child standing silent with his head bowed like that was something else entirely. "Mrs." Edna said softly, "I brought him home early. Mara, something happened at that new class of his." Mara knelt until she was level with her son, placed her calloused hands on those small shoulders, and asked in the gentlest voice she had, "What happened, baby? Tell me." Theo looked up, his eyes shining with tears he was trying to hold back. And it took him a long while before he finally spoke, each word falling apart as though every one of them was heavy. "They won't let me learn there anymore, Mom." Mara kept her voice very calm and asked, "Why, sweetheart? Did you do something wrong?" Theo shook his head, then lowered his eyes, and his answer made the whole room seem to fall silent. "I didn't do anything wrong. They said I don't belong there. They said kids like me should stay home." Mara felt something icy run down her spine, but she didn't let it show on her face. She stood, led her son inside, poured him a cup of warm milk, told him to sit and draw for a while, then stepped out into the hallway with Mrs. Edna, leaving the door slightly ajar so the boy wouldn't hear. And there, in the dimming afternoon light of the boarding house corridor, Mrs. Edna told her the rest, the part the boy didn't have enough words to express. She said, her voice trembling with anger, that when she came to pick Theo up, she found him standing alone outside the training room door, his face pale. Some of the other children told her that the owner of the training room, that man named Bruno or whatever he was called, had said in front of the whole class that the boy was the son of someone low and poor, that his fancy place wasn't meant for people like him and his mother, that he didn't take pocket change from people who had to scrub other people's floors for a living. Mrs. Edna went on, her voice choking, saying that he had even recorded the whole thing on his camera, turning the humiliation of a child into some kind of entertainment for people to watch. "I was going to storm in," she said, "but I was afraid I'd only make the boy more ashamed, so I just brought him home. I'm sorry, Mara." Mara stood there with her back against the cold wall, and for one very long moment, she couldn't say a word. She didn't feel anger in the way people usually felt anger. Not the kind of heat that rushed to the head and then faded. What she felt was far more frightening than that, a strange stillness. The kind of stillness only those who had once stood on a fighting floor could understand. The thick calm that appeared right before a decisive moment. She thanked Mrs. Edna, told her not to worry, then went back inside. Theo was sitting at the table, his sketchbook open before him, but the pencil lay motionless in his hand. The page still blank. The boy looked up at his mother and asked a question Mara later knew she would never forget. A question far too large for a 7-year-old child. "Mom, is it because we're poor that I don't deserve it?" Mara walked to him, gathered him into her arms, pressed her cheek against his tangled hair, and said in a voice so steady it surprised even her, "Listen to me. No one in this world gets to decide whether you deserve something or not. Do you hear me? Not anyone." Then she released him, looked into his eyes for a long time, and in that mother's gaze there was a light just beginning to burn, something no one had seen there in 2 years. She stood and walked toward the closet where her coat was hanging. Mara's hand stopped on the faded coat hanging in the closet, and in that moment she stood still, torn between the two people living inside her. One was the woman who had kept her head down for 2 years, the woman who had learned to swallow every humiliation, the woman who told herself that silence was the safest way to protect her child, that if she caused trouble, if she made things bigger, the consequences would fall on Theo and no one else. The other was something older, deeper, a voice she had buried along with the jacket beneath the bed, the voice of the old teacher from years ago, rising inside her as clearly as if he were standing right behind her, saying that the purpose of strength wasn't to bring someone down, but to keep the people you loved safe. She thought of her son's face when he asked whether it was because their family was poor that he didn't deserve it. She thought of the way the boy had lowered his head, the way he hadn't cried, and she understood that if she lowered her head today too, she would teach her child a lesson crueler than any insult, the lesson that poor people had to endure, that dignity was a luxury meant only for those with money, and that was something she would never allow to happen. Mara took down the coat. She put it on slowly, each movement strangely decisive, as though her body was remembering something her mind was still hesitating to accept. She stepped into the next room, where Theo was still sitting before the blank page, and she knelt to his level once more. "Listen to me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Mom has to go out for a little while. There are a few grown-up things I need to take care of. You'll go over to Mrs. Edna's and play there. Be good and listen to her. I'll be back soon." Theo looked up, and in his eyes flickered the worry of a child who had just been hurt and was afraid of losing something else. "Where are you going, Mom?" Mara smiled and placed her hand against his cheek. "I'm going to get back something that belongs to you," she said. "Something no one has the right to take from you." She explained nothing more, because the child didn't need to know, and because there were places where she absolutely didn't want her son to set foot. She led Theo to the end of the boarding house row, knocked on Mrs. Edna's door, and the elderly neighbor understood everything from a single look. She welcomed the boy inside, placed a hand on Mara's shoulder, and asked softly, "What are you going to do?" Mara looked at her, her gaze so calm it made Mrs. Edna shiver slightly. "I'm only going to ask for an explanation," she replied. Mrs. Edna took her hand and held it for a moment, then nodded. "Leave the boy here with me, as long as you need. Don't worry." Mara bent down and hugged her son one more time, kissed his forehead, told him to draw her something beautiful so she could see it when she came back. Then she stood and walked away without looking back, because she knew that if she turned and looked at her son's face for even one more second, the courage just beginning to burn inside her might waver. When she reached the end of the boarding house row, Mara stopped beside her old car, and for a moment she stood still in the afternoon light, drawing in a deep breath. She brought nothing with her, no weapon, no plan, only the faded coat on her body and a resolve that had hardened into stone inside her chest. She told herself she was going there only to talk, only to demand an explanation for her son, an apology, the smallest measure of respect that every human being deserved to receive. She told herself she wouldn't need the old version of herself, that the woman beneath the bed could keep sleeping. She got into the car, started the engine, and drove toward the elegant part of town where that room full of mirrors stood, unaware that in only a few dozen minutes, every word she had told herself would dissolve into smoke, and that tonight, for the first time in 2 years, the woman she had buried would be forced to wake. Bruno Halsey's training room stood in the wealthy west side of Ashport, a gleaming glass building with a proud gold-lettered sign hanging high above it. And the moment Mara pushed the door open and stepped inside, she felt that world rush toward her. The smell of leather, the smell of floor cleaner mixed with sweat, pounding music, endless reflections in the mirrors. The world she had sworn she would never return to. But what Mara didn't know was that she had walked in on a day when the air inside the training room was already stretched tight as a bowstring, because only a few minutes earlier, a man in a dark suit had called Bruno to remind him that today was the final deadline. Bruno Halsey, behind the glossy image of a gym owner famous online, was in fact drowning in debt, and his creditor wasn't a bank. He had borrowed a large sum from Cillian Reyes's organization to expand his place, to buy the expensive mirrors and build this false image of prosperity, and for many months he had been delaying payment again and again. That morning, he had received the final reminder that by afternoon someone would come in person. That anxiety made Bruno even more bitter, even more hungry for something that would prove his power in front of a crowd, some prey on whom he could vent his rage while entertaining the thousands of people watching his channel. And then that prey walked through the door on her own. When Bruno recognized the thin woman in the faded coat as the mother of the boy he had driven away that morning, a malicious smile spread across his lips. He waved to one student, signaled for the camera to be turned on at once, angled it toward the door, and raised his voice so the whole room could hear. "Well, look who's here," he said, "the mother of this morning's little boy. To everyone watching live, we've got a special guest today." Mara didn't stop. She walked straight into the middle of the mirror-filled room. From that very moment, everything unfolded just as thousands of eyes glued to their screens would witness it. The back-and-forth words, the humiliation growing more poisonous by the second, the way Bruno turned a mother's pain into entertainment in front of the camera. He didn't only mock her poverty. He went further than that. When one student blurted out that he had heard her husband was dead, Bruno seized on it at once, like an animal catching the scent of blood, and he laughed loudly, calling toward Mara in a tone of false pity that was even crueler than contempt, asking if that was why she had to scrub other people's floors, asking whether that husband of hers must not have been much of a man if he had left his wife and child in such misery. That was the line. Throughout her life, Mara had swallowed many things, had lowered her head before many things, but Daniel's name, the name of the man who had died while doing the work of keeping others safe, the father Theo still drew in his pictures. That name was not something for a man like Bruno Halsey to turn into a joke. Something changed in Mara's eyes, a stillness that the more perceptive people in the room began to sense. though they didn't yet understand why. Bruno didn't notice. He was drunk on his performance, drunk on the number of comments jumping endlessly across the screen, drunk on the feeling of power he thought he held completely in his hands. He stepped closer, and to push the little drama to its peak, to get the viral moment he craved, he did the very thing that would later become the beginning of his own downfall. He walked to the counter, opened a drawer, pulled out a thick stack of cash, and turned back toward the woman standing silently in the middle of the room. The entire training room seemed to hold its breath. The camera was still pointed straight at her. And outside, at the doorway at the far end of the room, a figure in a dark suit had just stepped in quietly, coming to collect the debt that Bruno didn't yet know he was about to pay with something far more expensive than money. Everything that happened next, the stack of cash slapped into her face, the cruel challenge, and the way that woman silently set her basket down on the floor and drew her left foot back, had all been decided from the moment Bruno dared speak her dead husband's name. Cillian's shout had not yet died out in the air when Bruno lunged forward, because to him, that cry was nothing more than a meaningless interruption from the man who had come to collect a debt, and his wounded pride now had only one target: to make the woman who dared stand still and challenge him collapse in front of the camera. He threw a straight punch, a blow launched with all the force of a big man used to bullying others, a blow meant to end everything, but that punch struck empty air. Mara didn't step back. She only tilted her body at the smallest angle, shifting her center of gravity to the side by about the width of a hand, just enough for Bruno's fist to sweep past her shoulder, carrying with it all the heavy momentum of his own body. In that instant, when Bruno's large frame faltered because of the missed strike, when all his weight pitched forward and lost its base, Mara began to move, and she moved in the way the old teacher had carved into her bones years ago, not to injure, but to control. Her hand caught the wrist rushing toward her, not yanking it hard but guiding it, directing his existing momentum downward in one clean arc. So Bruno's own strength became the very thing that pulled him off balance. The whole room only had time to see one seamless motion, so fast the naked eye could barely follow it. And in the next moment, the large man who had always boasted about his strength staggered several steps, his hands reaching wildly for something to hold, then pitched forward, and was neatly controlled down onto the training mat by the very force he had created himself. There was no loud crash, nothing dramatic in the way people usually imagined. There was only a sudden silence covering the room, the thick kind of silence that appears when dozens of people realize all at once that what has just happened before their eyes is entirely different from what they thought was possible. Bruno pushed himself up on his hands and struggled into a sitting position, his face flushed red, not from pain but from humiliation, from the unbelievable feeling that a thin woman half his size had just made him fall face first in the middle of his own training room, in front of a camera streaming live to thousands of people. He roared and rushed at her a second time, this time more savage, more out of control, with no technique left, only the fury of a man who had just been exposed. But fury had never been a match for calm. Mara was still there, her weight lowered, her hands open, and she read his attack as easily as reading a page. She stepped diagonally to one side, letting his charge slide past. And this time, instead of letting him fall, she did something else. She caught his arm, turned her body, and locked it into a hold that anyone who had ever studied self-defense would recognize at once, a joint lock that left the opponent completely immobilized, without needing a trace of brutality. Bruno was pinned down, one cheek pressed against the training mat, his arm held at an angle that made every attempt to struggle only bring him more pain, and he realized, in a burst of terror, that he was completely in this woman's hands. She could do anything she wanted in that moment. Everyone in the room understood that. The thousands of people behind their screens understood that. But Mara did nothing. She held him there only long enough for him to understand that his fate now rested in her choice. Then she slowly loosened her grip, released his arm, and stepped back. She didn't strike again. She didn't step on him, didn't speak a single word of humiliation, didn't do the very thing he had done to her son and to so many others. She simply stood upright, straightened her sleeve, and looked down at the man lying breathless on the floor with eyes that held no triumph, only a deep exhaustion and something almost like pity. Because for Mara, this had never been about winning or losing. She had not come here to bring a person down. She had come here for her son, and for something larger than that, something even she, in that brief moment, had not yet found the words to name. What no one in that room could see, what the live camera could never capture, was what had happened inside Mara in those few brief moments. Because to her, those 2 seconds didn't pass like 2 seconds. They stretched, widened, as though time had folded itself into something only she could step inside. From the very second she drew her left foot back and lowered her center of gravity, something strange happened. Her body remembered everything while her mind drifted to a place far away. She heard Sensei Crane's voice, not as a faint memory, but so clearly it was as if he were standing right behind her again, his aged hand resting on her shoulder to correct her stance, his calm, deep voice repeating the thing he had told her more times than she could ever count in those days. Don't ever fight with anger, Mara. Anger makes you blind. You fight with memory, with the people you love, and when you do that, your body will know what it has to do. She hadn't fully understood those words when she was young. She understood them now, because in the moment her body moved, she didn't see Bruno Halsey in front of her. She saw Daniel's face. Not his face on that fateful morning, but his face during the peaceful days, when he would lean against the doorway and watch her teach self-defense to the children in the neighborhood, smiling as he said she had been born to protect others. She saw the way he held her from behind on the nights she couldn't sleep, whispering that her strength wasn't in her fists, but in the way she always stood between the weak and the strong. For 2 years, she had believed her strength was the thing that had betrayed her, the useless thing that had failed her at the moment she needed it most. And she had hated it, had buried it. But right now, as her hands moved to protect her son's dignity, she suddenly understood something grief had hidden from her for so long. Her strength had never betrayed her. It had only been sleeping, waiting, patient the way her old teacher had once been patient, waiting for the exact day she would need it for a reason large enough. And she saw Theo. She saw her son's face that morning when he had eagerly put on his backpack to go to class, and she saw his face a few hours earlier when he lowered his head and asked whether it was because their family was poor that he didn't deserve it. She saw the blank page lying still beneath the pencil the boy no longer had the heart to use. It was that image, not anger, that guided every movement she made. She didn't bring Bruno down because she hated him. She did it so tomorrow, and every day after that, her son could lift his head and walk forward, so he would know there are things in this world no amount of money can buy and no rich man can take away, and one of those things is the right to be respected as a human being. That was why, when she locked Bruno's arm and the whole room held its breath waiting for something worse, she let go. Because Sensei Crane had taught her that the truly strong person wasn't the one who could cause the most harm, but the one who had enough power to do it and chose not to. Daniel had lived his whole life by that truth, running into danger so others could be safe, and she wouldn't betray his memory by turning herself into another version of the very man who had humiliated her. When she stepped back and stood upright, her eyes didn't search for the crowd's approval, didn't search for the camera. In that moment, deep inside herself, she only whispered one sentence to the 2 men who had shaped the person she was, the teacher who had taught her the meaning of strength, and the husband who had taught her the meaning of love. I understand now, Sensei. I understand now, Daniel. And for the first time after 2 long years, the woman she had buried beneath the bed was no longer a wound, but had returned as a healed part of herself. Cillian Reyes was the first to break the thick silence covering the room, and he did it by walking slowly from the doorway into the middle of the training floor, his eyes never leaving the woman who had just straightened to her full height. Through many years of holding power in his hands, Cillian had grown used to people falling silent when he entered a room, but this time, the silence wasn't for him, it was for her, and that only made him more certain of what he had just recognized. He stopped a few steps from Mara, and when he spoke, his voice was low and clear, loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough for the camera that was still running to capture every word. "That stance," he said, left foot set back, weight lowered, both hands open and still. "I've only seen it once in my life." Mara lifted her eyes to look at him, and for the first time since she had stepped into the training room, a flicker of surprise appeared in them. Cillian went on, his voice sinking a little, carrying something almost like reverence. "Many years ago, when I was nothing but a worthless street kid, a man picked me up and taught me that strength wasn't meant to torment the weak. His name was Aldous Crane, and he told me that stance was something he had passed on to only a very few people he considered his own children." He looked straight at Mara and spoke each word slowly. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Mara didn't answer, but her silence was already an answer, and Cillian gave a faint nod, as though he had just confirmed something sacred. Then he turned toward the crowd, and this time his voice changed completely, cold and filled with the authority of a man accustomed to giving orders. "You just filmed a student of Aldous Crane," he said, "and this woman could have put that man in the hospital if she had wanted to, but she let go. That is what you should remember." The training room began to murmur, thousands of comments jumping non-stop across the live stream screen, and the name Aldous Crane began to be typed over and over in the endless stream of words. Bruno, who had managed to struggle back onto his feet by then, his face still pale, looked at Cillian with a mixture of fear and wounded pride, and he stammered, "What are you doing here? This has nothing to do with you." Cillian turned to him, and his gaze was so cold that Bruno instinctively stepped back. "I came to remind you about your debt," Cillian said quietly, "but it seems today you owe far more than money." He left the sentence hanging in the air, then added, in the tone of a warning that didn't need to be shouted, "There is one rule my organization never breaks, under any circumstances. We never touch women and children. And you just did both, in front of thousands of people, with a child and his mother." Bruno opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out, because for the first time in his life, he realized he was standing between two forces he couldn't possibly fight, a powerful man to whom he owed money, and a woman he had just humiliated who had turned out to be many times stronger than he was. Meanwhile, Mara no longer cared about the words being traded around her. She bent down, picked her basket up from the floor, lightly brushed the dust from it, and stood straight again. The bills Bruno had slapped into her face were still scattered across the training floor, $20,000 lying at her feet, and every eye in the room waited to see whether she would bend down and pick them up, but Mara didn't glance at them even once. She stepped over those bills as though stepping over meaningless dry leaves, walked toward the door, and paused only for a moment as she passed Cillian. The two of them looked at each other in silence, two people carrying the same mark of the same teacher, and neither of them said another word, because some things have no need for words. Then Mara pushed the door open and stepped outside, leaving behind the room full of mirrors, leaving behind the stunned crowd, leaving behind the money scattered across the floor, and leaving behind a man who had just lost far more than he could understand in that moment. Mara drove home in the fading afternoon light, both hands still steady on the steering wheel, and she had no idea that the live video Bruno had turned on with his own hands to humiliate her had already begun a journey no one could stop. Within a few hours, clips cut from that live stream had been shared everywhere, from one person to another, and by late night, the image of a thin woman in a faded coat, silently stepping over the scattered money without even glancing down, had been watched by millions. People didn't talk much about the martial arts movements. What moved them, what made them share it again and again, was the moment she let go, when she could have done the opposite, the way she stood upright with her dignity intact in the middle of a room that had tried to humiliate her. The words of the strange man who said she was the student of a legend named Aldous Crane. They gave her a name, the mother no one dared look past twice, and that name spread like a small, warm flame through a world that had grown far too used to cruelty. But Mara knew nothing about any of it, and even if she had known, she wouldn't have wanted it. She came home, stopped by Mrs. Edna's to pick up Theo, thanked the elderly neighbor with a longer hug than usual, then led her son back to their small apartment. She didn't tell Theo what had happened at the training room. She simply did what she did every evening, hung up her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and set a pot on the stove to cook dinner for her son. The cramped kitchen filled again with the smell of hot rice and the simple stew Theo loved. And for a little while, everything returned to normal, as though that afternoon had never happened. Theo sat at the table, drawing a new picture, and this time the page was no longer blank, the pencil moving across the paper the way it always had. It wasn't until the next morning, when Theo went over to Mrs. Edna's for a little while, that the boy accidentally overheard the adults talking and learned that the night before, his mother had done something that made the whole city speak her name. He wasn't allowed to watch those clips. Mrs. Edna had carefully kept the phone away from a child's eyes, but what he heard was already enough. He heard people say that his mother had stood firm before a man who had tried to shame her, that his mother hadn't bowed her head, that a powerful man had called his mother the student of a legendary master. Theo ran home, opened the door, and stood frozen on the threshold, looking at his mother as she folded a stack of clothes by the window, looking at her with a gaze he had never had before. Mara looked up, caught that gaze, and for a moment she didn't understand what was happening. "Mom," Theo said, his voice trembling with an emotion too large for his small chest. "Did you stand up for me?" Mara set down the stack of clothes, walked over, and knelt to his level the way she always did, and she didn't answer right away. She looked into her son's eyes exactly like his father's, and there she no longer saw the shame of yesterday, no longer saw the painful question of whether he deserved anything at all. Instead, there was a new light, a hesitant pride, the pride of a child who had just realized that his mother, the woman who scrubbed other people's floors to feed him, the mother with the faded apron and calloused hands, was the strongest person he had ever known. "Yes, sweetheart," Mara said softly. "I stood up for you. And I'll always stand up for you, no matter what happens." Theo threw himself into his mother's arms and held her tightly, and this time he cried, but those tears were very different from yesterday's. Mara held her son, pressed her cheek against his hair, and believed that the worst had passed, that she had taken back her child's dignity, and that everything would be all right. She couldn't have known that at that very moment, on the other side of the city, a man who had just been exposed before millions was sitting in the darkness, feeding a plan for revenge. Bruno Halsey understood one thing that few men in the middle of his humiliation would have been clear-headed enough to realize, that in the world of viral clips, the truth didn't matter as much as the story people told, and whoever held the scissors for cutting and splicing held the truth. All through that night, instead of sleeping, he sat in front of the screen, rewinding the original video again and again, and he cut. He cut away everything he had said, the insults about poverty, the mockery of the dead husband, the moment he pulled out the stack of cash and slapped it into Mara's face, the moment he lunged forward and attacked first. He cut it all. What he kept was only a few brief seconds. The image of a strange woman locking his arm and pinning him to the floor, laid over with sorrowful music and captions crying out for sympathy. The next morning, he started a new live stream. This time, there was no boastful man throwing punches at heavy bags. This time, there was an entirely different Bruno, his voice choking, his eyes reddened, one arm carefully bandaged even though there was no injury worth mentioning. He sat before the camera, wiping away tears he didn't need to have, and told a story staged with meticulous care. "I'm just an honest businessman," he said, his voice trembling. "I built this training room from nothing with my own hands. I tried to create a decent place for people to train, and yet yesterday, a strange woman stormed into my place and attacked me for no reason, in front of my students. I've only just learned that she's a formally trained fighter, a dangerous person, and she used that to assault an innocent man like me. I'm scared. I don't know when she'll come back." He let his voice break at exactly the right moment, and the comments began to change. The crowd that had so easily been moved by Mara's story was now just as easily moved by Bruno's false tears, because that was the nature of a crowd. It flowed with the last emotion it had been given to drink, and Bruno had skillfully poured them a new dose. Within a single day, the wind had shifted. The people who yesterday had praised the mother no one dared look past twice now turned around and cursed a dangerous attacker, hiding beneath the mask of a victim. People dug, people speculated, people condemned her with poisonous words they didn't even bother to verify. Someone even tracked down where she lived. And that was when the storm spilled from the virtual world into Mara's real life. The poor boarding house in Ashport began to have strangers loitering around it. Phone calls came to a number she didn't understand how they had found. Anonymous voices dropping threats before hanging up. One morning, she opened the door and saw that someone had smeared vicious, scrawled words across the hallway wall outside her apartment. "Mrs." Edna told her that tabloid reporters had come all the way to the boarding house to question the neighbors, twisting stories about her into something ugly. Mara stood looking at the defaced wall, her heart heavy, not because she feared for herself, but because she was thinking of Theo. She had done all of this to win back her child's dignity, and yet now her own son was at risk of growing up amid gossip, amid prying eyes, amid a world that had already decided poor people had no right to be believed. She kept Theo inside more often, told the boy not to speak to strangers, and every night she lay awake, wondering whether she had done the right thing, whether silence and lowered eyes through the past 2 years might, in the end, have been safer after all. But then she thought of the pride in her son's eyes when he realized his mother had stood up, and she knew she couldn't return to the old version of herself anymore. She had awakened, and there are some things that, once awakened, can't be put back to sleep. What she didn't know was that Bruno's counterattack was only the beginning, that he had no intention of stopping at false tears, and that his next blow would be aimed straight at the most precious thing she had. Bruno's next blow came in the form of a beige envelope, handed directly to Mara by a strange man one morning. and when she opened it, she had to read it again and again before she could fully understand the cruelty of what was being aimed at her. It was a civil lawsuit. Bruno Halsey, backed by an expensive law firm he had hired with the very donation money raised from his false tears, was suing her for $200,000 in damages, claiming physical assault, emotional distress, and harm to his business and reputation. $200,000. A number Mara couldn't possibly earn even if she worked for 100 years with her calloused hands. She sat down at the kitchen table, placed the papers beside the stack of medical bill envelopes she had already been struggling to pay $1 at a time, and for the first time since Daniel died, she felt real fear choking her chest, because she understood that no matter how absurd the lawsuit was, the act of fighting it alone would be enough to drown her, enough to drain the small savings she had scraped together for her son, enough to cost her this little apartment, enough to take away her ability to put daily meals in front of Theo. But even that wasn't the thing that hurt her most. A few days after the lawsuit papers arrived, a social worker knocked on her door. The woman wasn't rude at all. On the contrary, she was very polite and even seemed somewhat apologetic. But what she said made the ground beneath Mara's feet feel as though it had collapsed. She explained that the Family Welfare Office had received several reports, that someone had accused Mara of being a violent and dangerous person, that the child's living environment might not be safe, and that according to procedure, they were required to open an evaluation. Mara understood at once who stood behind those accusations. Bruno didn't only want to take away her money and her honor, he was aiming directly at the only thing left that gave her life meaning, Theo. The social worker stepped into the apartment, looked around the small, poor but clean home, looked at Theo's study table with drawings taped all over the wall, looked at the pot of oatmeal still warm on the stove, and Mara stood there, forcing her voice to remain calm as she answered each question, even though inside she was breaking apart. She wasn't allowed to appear angry, wasn't allowed to appear out of control, because she knew that any reaction from her could be recorded and used against her. She could only stand there, a mother forced to prove she deserved to raise her own child, and the injustice of it cut into her heart more deeply than any insult Bruno had ever thrown at her. Fortunately, the initial evaluation found nothing alarming, and the social worker left with a sympathetic look, even quietly saying that she believed everything would be all right. But the dark cloud had already hung over Mara and her son, and it wouldn't disappear until the lawsuit was resolved. That night, after Theo had fallen deeply asleep, Mara sat alone in the darkness of the kitchen. The lawsuit papers and the stack of medical bill envelopes spread before her like a sentence. She had stood up once, and this world had answered by trying to crush her and the child she loved. In that weakest moment, a poisonous thought whispered through her mind that perhaps she should apologize, should lower her head, should find a way to negotiate with Bruno so he would withdraw the lawsuit, even if that meant admitting to a guilt she had never committed. Perhaps bowing her head was still the safest way, just as she had believed for the past 2 years. She buried her face in her calloused hands, and for the first time in a very long while, that strong woman allowed herself to cry in silence. She didn't yet know that in those darkest hours, in different places across the city, people who had seen her story were quietly deciding that they wouldn't let her face this storm alone. The first person to knock on Mara's door wasn't an enemy, but a woman she had only met a few times in the boarding house hallway. Renata Okafor lived downstairs, a woman of about 40 with a straight posture and sharp eyes. Someone Mara only vaguely knew worked in law, though they had never exchanged more than a few greetings. That morning, Renata arrived holding 2 cups of hot coffee, and she set one down on the table in front of Mara without needing to be invited. "I watched the video," Renata said bluntly, "both the original footage and that man's filthy edited version, and I read that he's suing you." Mara looked at her neighbor, still not understanding, and Renata smiled, a smile both weary and firm. "I'm a lawyer," she said, 20 years in the profession, most of it defending people who can't afford to hire anyone to protect them. I've seen too many rich men use money and the law to crush poor people, and I'm too tired of standing by and watching. I'm taking this case. I won't take a penny from you." Mara opened her mouth to refuse, to say she couldn't accept such a great favor, that she had nothing to give in return. But Renata lifted a hand to stop her. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "There are things people do not because they're paid, but because if they don't do them, they won't be able to sleep in peace. You stood up for your son. Now let me stand with you." And as though Renata's words had opened some hidden door, other people began to appear. News of the lawsuit reached Sister Agnes, an elderly nun, who ran the charity kitchen where Mara sometimes stopped by to help on the days she had time. Sister Agnes was a small woman with a gentle face, but a will as hard as steel. A woman who had spent her whole life serving the people the world had forgotten in this part of Ashport. She knew Bruno Halsey. She had heard far too many stories about that man. Stories that had never been told because his victims were all poor people. People who believed their voices weren't worth anything, and she decided it was time those stories were spoken aloud. Sister Agnes began quietly knocking on door after door, sitting down with each person, listening. She found a single mother who had once been thrown out of the training room by Bruno and humiliated in the same way he had humiliated Theo. She found a young man who had once worked for him and had been cheated out of his wages, then threatened when he dared ask for them. She found an older man who had witnessed the way Bruno treated poor students and had carried his anger quietly for many years because he hadn't known what to do. One by one, they hesitated. They were afraid, because standing up against someone with money and influence online had never been easy. But Sister Agnes told them something simple, that a single candle could easily be blown out, but when many candles burned together, no wind could put them out. And then a small miracle began to happen. One person saw another dare to speak, and they found courage for themselves. One afternoon, Renata arranged a meeting in Sister Agnes's charity kitchen, and Mara walked into that plain room to find that she wasn't alone. There were strangers sitting there, people carrying the same wound Bruno had caused, and they looked at her not with pity, but with the eyes of people standing on the same side of the fight. Mara stood among them, her throat tightening, and for the first time since the lawsuit papers had been placed in her hands, she felt the dark cloud above her lift a little. She had walked into Bruno's training room alone that day, believing she would have to bear every consequence alone. But it turned out that when one person dared to stand up, they unknowingly handed others the courage to stand up too. And one person standing up could be alone, but many people standing together became something no power, no money, could easily crush. Renata looked around the room full of brave faces, then turned to Mara and said softly, "Now we've got a real case." On the other side of the city, in a spacious office overlooking Ashport Harbor, Cillian Reyes stood by the window with a glass of liquor he hadn't once brought to his lips, and for the first time in many years, the man who was used to giving orders to others couldn't command the thoughts inside his own head. He had followed every turn of the matter since that afternoon he stepped into the training room to collect a debt. He knew about the edited clip, knew about the $200,000 lawsuit, knew about the welfare investigation Bruno had quietly set in motion to target that woman's child. And every piece of news made something inside him, something he had thought had long since hardened over, ache again, because Cillian had seen everything with his own eyes. He had stood in the doorway that day, had seen Bruno slap the stack of money into Mara's face, had seen him lunge forward and attack first, had seen that woman let go when she could have done the opposite. His testimony could change the entire course of the lawsuit. But standing up as a witness meant walking into a courtroom, meant declaring his identity before the law, meant pulling the attention of the court and investigators toward a man like him, a man with too many things in his past that couldn't bear the light. That was why he was torn. All his life, Cillian had lived by one simple rule: stay outside, don't get involved, let things pass and preserve the world he had worked so hard to build. Standing up for a strange woman went against everything that had kept him safe for so long. But that night, standing beside the window, Cillian remembered something he had tried to bury for decades. He remembered his mother. He had grown up in a neighborhood even poorer than Ashport, and his mother had been a woman who worked herself to exhaustion, raising her son alone with no one to protect her. He remembered the times people humiliated her simply because she was poor, because she had no one standing behind her, because she was the kind of person the world believed it could trample without paying a price. He remembered the helplessness of a little boy, watching his mother being treated as though she wasn't a human being. And he remembered the silent vow he had made to himself then, that one day he would become so powerful no one would ever trample him and his mother again. He had become powerful indeed. He had power, money, and an entire organization that bowed its head at his word. But his mother was no longer there to see it. And the unbreakable rule his whole organization had to obey, never touch women and children, wasn't some reckless underworld law made on a whim, but the only legacy he still kept from his dead mother, the way he protected her memory in a life where he had lost too many other things. When Cillian saw Mara standing in that room full of mirrors with her dignity intact, when he saw a poor mother humiliated simply because she had dared ask for fairness for her child, he hadn't seen a stranger. He had seen his mother. And now, as Bruno used money and lies to crush that woman and her child, Cillian understood that if he kept standing aside, he would only become that helpless boy from years ago all over again, watching injustice happen and doing nothing. He set the glass of liquor down on the windowsill. He had built an entire empire on never exposing himself, never putting himself in danger for anyone else. But there are debts that can't be paid with money, and there are people whose silence becomes complicity. The next morning, Cillian Reyes did something that left even his most trusted men stunned. He summoned his personal lawyer, not to protect himself, but to contact a female attorney named Renata Okafor and send along one brief message. Tell her there is a witness who saw everything that happened that day, and that witness is willing to appear in court. When he hung up, he stood still for a long while, and for the first time in so many years, he felt lighter, as though he had just begun to repay a debt he had owed for a very long time. Not to Mara, but to the woman who had given birth to him. Courtroom number 4 of the Ashport courthouse was packed on the morning the trial took place, and Mara walked in wearing the plainest but neatest clothes she owned, leaving the faded coat at home and replacing it with a white shirt whose collar was worn but which she had ironed smooth the night before. Theo wasn't there. Mara had left him with Mrs. Edna, with careful instructions, because no matter what happened, she absolutely didn't want her child to set foot in this cold room, didn't want him to hear people argue over whether his mother was a dangerous person. Across the room, Bruno Halsey sat among a row of lawyers in expensive suits, still wearing the pitiful victim's expression he had polished over the past several weeks, occasionally lifting a hand to rub his shoulder as though it still hurt. Beside Mara, there was only one person, Renata Okafor, with a folder of documents and a computer, but her eyes were as calm as the surface of water before a storm. Bruno's lawyer, a gray-haired man with a voice as smooth as silk, opened with a carefully staged presentation. He built before the court the image of a woman entirely different from the Mara everyone was seeing. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing toward her without bothering to look. "The person sitting there isn't the harmless mother she appears to be. This is a formally trained fighter, a student of a notorious martial arts master, a person capable of inflicting serious harm on anyone. She entered my client's place of business without permission and with clear intent, and she carried out a calculated, deliberate attack, using her dangerous skills to assault an honest businessman." He presented the edited clip. A few short seconds, showing Mara locking Bruno's arm and pinning him to the floor, separated from every piece of context, and whispers rippled through the room. He painted the picture of a predator armed with skill, a danger to the community, a mother whose very presence was a threat to her own child. Every word he spoke was calculated to dig into the court's fears, and Mara had to sit there, silently enduring it, while people twisted her act of protecting her son into a crime. Then it was Renata's turn. She stood without hurry, buttoned her jacket, and stepped into the center of the room with a composure that made the entire courtroom settle into silence. "My client is indeed a trained person," she began, "and that is exactly why the court should pay attention to one thing. A person capable of causing serious injury, if she truly intended to attack, would not have allowed the other party to stand up and walk away intact." She let the sentence sink in, then turned to the computer. "But before we discuss my client," she said, "let us look at who the plaintiff truly is." And she began to play the footage, not one clip, but a whole series of them. Videos taken directly from Bruno Halsey's own public channel over many years, clips he had once proudly posted to flaunt his power. Bruno shoving a student to the floor and laughing at him. Bruno blocking an older man's path and making threats. Bruno humiliating a young woman in front of the camera, turning someone else's vulnerability into entertainment for the crowd. One clip after another, a portrait slowly emerged, not of a pitiful victim, but of a man accustomed to using aggression to dominate those weaker than himself. Bruno's lawyer's face began to tighten, and Bruno himself changed color. Then Renata called her first witness. A young woman stepped onto the stand, her hands clenched together, and in a trembling but determined voice, she told her own story, about the day Bruno had thrown her out of the training room and humiliated her in exactly the same way he had done to Mara's son, simply because she didn't have enough money and didn't hold enough status in his eyes. "I stayed silent for 2 years, she said, because I thought no one would believe someone like me, but when I saw someone dare to stand up, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." The whole courtroom fell quiet, and for the first time since the trial began, Mara felt the invisible scales begin to shift. When Renata called the name of her next witness, every eye in the courtroom turned toward the door, and the man who walked in sent whispers rippling through the room like waves, because even those who didn't know much about him could feel the authority radiating from every step he took. Cillian Reyes wore a dark suit and walked straight to the witness stand, and when he placed his hand to take the oath, he knew very well that he was doing something that went against every principle that had kept him safe his entire life. Testifying in court meant leaving a trace, meant exposing his presence before the law, meant accepting a risk no one in his position would willingly carry. Bruno's lawyer recognized that at once and tried to twist it, pressing him about who he was, what he did for a living, what connection he had to either side, each question a trap laid to undermine his credibility. But Cillian didn't dodge. "I came to the training room that day for reasons of my own," he said, his voice low and steady, "and I won't pretend I'm a perfect man, but I stood in that doorway, and I saw everything from beginning to end. I saw that man slap money into a woman's face. I saw him rush forward and attack her first. And I saw her, a person fully capable of putting him in the hospital, choose to let go. A person like that isn't an attacker, Your Honor. That is someone with more restraint than anyone in this room." His testimony, coming from a man who clearly had no reason to defend Mara, carried a weight that no argument from the other lawyer could shake. But Renata still had one final strike left, and she delivered it with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff has submitted a video to the court as evidence, a video he personally uploaded after the incident. But there is one thing the plaintiff seems to have forgotten. That day, he live-streamed the entire incident himself. And when someone live-streams, the platform automatically preserves the full original recording on its system. A complete, continuous, uncut record entirely beyond his ability to edit." Bruno's face went white. Renata asked the court to allow the original recording to be played, the one she had obtained through a court order sent to the platform, and she emphasized the crucial difference, that the version Bruno had submitted was only a few edited seconds, while the original saved by the system was much longer and showed everything. The entire courtroom held its breath as the video began to play. And this time, nothing was hidden. People saw Bruno turn on the camera to turn Mara into entertainment. They heard every word as he insulted her poverty, every word as he mocked her dead husband. They saw him pull out the stack of money and slap it into her face. They saw him charge forward and strike first. And they saw Mara, after she had completely subdued him, quietly let go and step back. The truth, whole and undeniable, was laid bare before everyone's eyes. Renata turned toward Bruno's lawyer, her voice now sharp as a blade. "Your client had the full recording from the very beginning," she said. "He deliberately submitted an edited version to mislead the court and conceal his own actions. That isn't merely dishonest testimony, Your Honor. That is the intentional concealment of evidence." The judge, an older man with a stern face, removed his glasses and looked toward the plaintiff's table for a long moment in silence. Then he spoke, each word slow and heavy. "The deliberate submission of fabricated evidence and concealment of the original recording is a contempt for the law that this court cannot tolerate. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed in its entirety, and this court will refer the plaintiff's conduct, along with the conduct of his legal team, to the appropriate authorities for review." The gavel struck, firm and final, ending everything. Bruno sat frozen in his chair, the victim's mask he had worked so hard to build shattering before hundreds of people. Mara closed her eyes, and 2 years of pressure, the fear of losing her son, the sleepless nights, all seemed to dissolve at once. When she opened her eyes, the first person she looked for was Renata, then Cillian, who was quietly rising to leave. And in the moment their eyes met, she gave him a faint nod, a thank you that needed no voice. The welfare investigation was closed soon after. The dark cloud hanging over Mara and her son finally lifted, and for the first time in a very long while, Mara knew she could go home and hold her child without any fear weighing her down. Once the truth had been brought into the light, nothing could hide it again, and Bruno Halsey's downfall came so quickly that even he had no time to defend himself. The original recording of the live stream, now recognized by the court, spread everywhere and swept away the victim's mask he had worked so hard to build. The platform where he made his living deleted his channel for serious violations involving harassment and deception. The money he had once raised through false tears had to be returned, and the sponsors who had once gathered around him quietly withdrew without a word. The glossy training room with its expensive mirrors lost its lease when he could no longer pay his debts, and one by one, the people he had once trampled on in earlier years, strengthened by the courage they had seen in court, began stepping forward to demand justice for themselves. The man who had once believed money and lies could crush anyone was finally crushed by the very truth he had tried to hide. As for Mara, she didn't celebrate. She returned to her life, to her work shifts and the meals she cooked for her son, but something inside her had changed forever. The woman she had once buried beneath the bed had returned, not as a wound, but as a gift she could give to others. She opened a free self-defense class right in Sister Agnes's charity kitchen, for the poor women and children of Ashport, the people the world had long assumed it could trample without paying any price. She taught them not so they could hurt anyone, but so they would know how to stand tall, so they would understand that their dignity was something no one had the right to take away. People began calling the principles she taught by a simple name, the Voss Standard, after her name and the name of her late husband, a reminder that true strength lives in kindness and restraint. That small class slowly grew, and then similar classes began appearing in other poor neighborhoods, a quiet movement spreading from one heart to another. And there was one thing Mara only learned much later, that the room where she taught, the training mats, and the expenses she never could have afforded on her own had all been provided by an anonymous donor. She never received confirmation, but in her heart she understood. It was the way a man who had once stood in that doorway chose to repay a debt to his own late mother. Theo grew up in those days with a pride nothing could shake. The little boy who had once lowered his head and asked his mother whether it was because their family was poor that he didn't deserve anything now sat in the corner of his mother's classroom every weekend, drawing pictures of a woman standing tall in the middle of a crowd, and he understood, in the deepest way a child can understand, that a person's worth had never been measured by the amount of money in their pocket. Mara Voss's story reminds us of something simple, that the world sometimes forgets, that dignity doesn't belong to the rich or to the poor. It belongs to everyone, and no one, no matter how much money or power they have, is allowed to take it from another person. It reminds us that true strength doesn't lie in bringing someone else down, but in kindness and restraint, that standing up to protect your own dignity and the dignity of the vulnerable has never been easy, but it has always been worth doing. And it reminds us that the good things we build inside ourselves, courage, kindness, love, never truly disappear. They only wait for the right moment to wake. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories to more people every day. How do you feel about Mara's story? And have you ever witnessed or stood up yourself for someone's dignity? Please leave a comment below, because we truly hope to hear the feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for listening all the way to this moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health and a joyful, peaceful life every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in